All right, guys, it's official. The expansion draft for the WNBA is officially in the books, and the league's two newest franchises, the Toronto Tempo and the Portland Fire, now have the foundation of their rosters. And there's a lot to unpack here. Because while expansion drafts are exciting for the new teams entering the league, they can be pretty painful for the existing teams that have to leave players exposed. And one of the teams that definitely felt the impact of this draft was the Indiana Fever. Indiana ended up losing 2 players in this process, and fans are definitely talking about it. So let's start there. One of the players taken from Indiana was Kristy Wallace. Now, this one is interesting because Wallace didn't actually play for the Fever last season. She spent the year overseas and chose not to come over. But technically, she was still part of Indiana's roster rights moving forward. So even though fans didn't see her on the floor last season, she was still considered part of the Fever's future plans. Now, those rights belong to another team after the expansion draft. The other loss for Indiana is a player that a lot of Fever fans really liked, Bibby. Bibby, also known by some fans as the Red Bomber, became a bit of a fan favorite. A lot of people felt like she had the potential to be a really solid fit alongside Caitlin Clark. When you look at Clark's style of play, the pace, the spacing, the pick-and-pop opportunities, Bibby looked like the kind of stretch 4 who could really thrive in that system. She can knock down shots from the perimeter, space the floor, and operate as a corner shooter, which is incredibly valuable when you have a playmaker like Clark running the offense. Unfortunately, Bibby also dealt with injuries last season, and honestly, the entire Indiana roster struggled with injuries throughout the year. It felt like every couple of weeks someone else was going down, which made it really hard for the team to build consistency. But now, Bibby has been selected in the expansion draft, and from the reports, it appears she's heading to the Portland Fire. And speaking of Toronto, they were pretty active during this draft. They selected Marina Mabrey, which is a pretty big move because she was one of the more notable names available in the pool. They also grabbed Julie Almond from the Los Angeles Sparks and Aaliyah Nye from the Las Vegas Aces. And of course, they picked up Kristy Wallace from Indiana as well. So Toronto clearly focused on bringing in players who can shoot, handle the ball, and provide some versatility right away. They also still hold their future draft assets, which means this roster is likely far from finished. They also added Lexi Held, who previously spent time with the Phoenix Mercury. Now, one name I talked about in a previous video was Bridget Carleton. I mentioned that if Indiana ever lost Kelsey Mitchell in the future, Carleton could potentially be a really interesting replacement option. Well, that idea is officially off the table now. Carleton ended up being the very first pick in the expansion draft, which tells you exactly how highly the new franchise values her. She's clearly someone they see as a major building block. And honestly, that makes sense. Carleton is experienced, she's versatile, and she understands how to contribute within different systems. Now, switching over to Portland, I actually like several of the moves they made. One addition that really stands out to me is Sarah Ashley Barker from the Los Angeles Sparks. I honestly thought Los Angeles might protect her, but when you look at that roster, it becomes clear how difficult that decision probably was. When you look at the Sparks, they already have a ton of young talent, including players like Kelsey Plum, Cameron Brink, Azura Stevens, and Rickea Jackson. At some point, it really does become a numbers game. But for Barker, this could be a huge opportunity. Going to Portland Fire likely means she'll get real minutes and a chance to prove herself in a bigger role. Portland also added Sug Sutton from the Washington Mystics and selected Nika Moole, the former UConn Huskies women's basketball standout who most recently played for the Seattle Storm. Unfortunately, Moole is currently dealing with another torn ACL, which means she'll likely miss the upcoming season. Portland also rounded out their selections with players like Carla Late, Emily Engstler, Maya Caldwell, and Haley Jones. So, when you look at the overall picture, the Portland Fire did a pretty solid job building the early foundation of their roster. And personally, I really like the potential combination of Bridget Carleton and Sarah Ashley Barker. That pairing could end up being one of the more underrated duos coming out of this expansion draft. We'll see how it all plays out. Now let's move here. So this was actually the early wave of news coming out after the WNBA expansion draft wrapped up. And another interesting detail started to surface shortly after. According to reports from Underdog WNBA, a couple of the players selected in the draft are also potential unrestricted free agents. That part is important. For example, the Toronto Tempo selected Marina Mabrey, while the Portland Fire used one of their picks on Bridget Carleton. Both of those players are entering unrestricted free agency, which means technically they could sign anywhere. But let's be honest about how this usually works. When a team spends such a high pick on a player in an expansion draft, they're doing it with the expectation that they'll try to lock that player up long term. In other words, Toronto and Portland will likely offer those players as much money as they can within the league rules to convince them to stay. Each expansion team was allowed to select one potential free agent in the draft pool, so that's essentially the situation we're looking at here. Now, with the draft finished, the focus shifts back to the Indiana Fever and what they're going to do next. Indiana ended up losing 2 players in the expansion process, including Chloe Bibby and Kristy Wallace. But if we're being completely honest, this probably doesn't drastically change the Fever's plans. Bibby had some flashes, but it never really felt like she was guaranteed to be part of the long-term core. And Wallace didn't even play last season, so she was already somewhat of a question mark moving forward. Still, this offseason is incredibly important for Indiana, because if we're being real, the way the roster was built last offseason just didn't work. There were a lot of questionable moves, and the overall direction of the team felt confusing at times. You had veterans like Natasha Howard coming in with big expectations, talking about things like MVP-level impact. Then you had money tied up in players like DeWanna Bonner. On paper, it sounded ambitious, but once the season started, it just didn't translate the way people hoped. Some of that also circles back to head coach Stephanie White. When you bring in players you've coached before or already have strong relationships with, sometimes those decisions come from familiarity rather than pure roster fit. And that's the key issue here. The Fever need to build a team that actually fits around their 2 franchise cornerstones, Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston. So, tough decisions are coming. Veterans like Brianna Turner, Sydney Colson, Ariel Atkins, and Odyssey Sims could all be part of those conversations as the front office evaluates the roster. But the biggest question might still revolve around Kelsey Mitchell. She's one of the most talented scorers on the team, but the Fever have to decide how she fits into their long-term vision. Whether they keep her as a core piece or move in another direction could end up being one of the defining decisions of this entire offseason. We'll see how it plays out. All right, let's take a quick look at this. Caitlin Clark recently sat down and talked about what it truly means to represent the Indiana Fever and play in Indiana. It's a short clip, but it says a lot about her mindset. Let's check it out real quick.
I think growing up I had a lot of really good coaches. Whether that was when I was really young, my dad was my first ever coach, and getting to see him not only as my dad, but as my basketball coach. And I feel like I was always raised in the right way. Like, it wasn't always sports first. It was putting everything before that, whether it was school, whether it was taking care of yourself, whether it was getting along with my siblings. Like, that's just how I was raised. It was never basketball. And as a kid, that's probably what you want it to be, is just be sports all the time. That's certainly what I wanted, but it was everything else, and I think that's helped me a lot. Now that I'm a professional athlete, you realize, like, this isn't everything to you, right? It's what you get to do, and it helps you make a living, but it's not your all. And I think, like, as I moved into college, my college coach, Coach Booter, is going to be in the Hall of Fame one day. She's a tremendous coach, but I get asked this a lot, and I say this, like, like mentors, but I also feel like I have a lot of really, really good teammates that I was able to learn from. And maybe you don't always like look at a teammate as somebody that's like a mentor, but for me, I feel like I did. Like, I had great captains on teams that I was on, whether it was my first time in the league or whether when I was the first showed up at Iowa. So I feel like I've had a lot of tremendous teammates that have helped me kind of flourish and kind of learn the game and learn each other and build different relationships. I'd say that.
And I appreciate that, because a lot of people don't recognize and appreciate your humility. But before you can lead, you have to learn to follow. And I watched you do that. that's why you acknowledge your captains, you acknowledge your coaches, because you understood that it was very important to not only be a terrific performer, but also love on the people around you and be the best version of yourself. And I appreciate that about you. Darren.
So that's what Caitlin Clark had to say while speaking during the NCAA Women's Final Four. It's always interesting hearing her perspective on the game and what it means to represent the Indiana Fever. But with the expansion draft now finished, Indiana has officially lost Chloe Bibby and Kristy Wallace, so there are definitely some roster questions moving forward. I'm curious what you guys think about these moves and how the Fever should respond this offseason. Jump down in the comments and let me know your thoughts. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more updates.